The auctioneer's voice carried across the dusty fairground on a bright Saturday morning in Iowa, rising above the murmur of farmers, mechanics, and neighbors who had gathered to watch the Whitaker estate auction. Rows of worn equipment stood beneath the sun. Rusted plows, milk separators, feed bins, and broken tractor parts waited for bids. Most people came hoping to find something useful. Harold Mercer stood near the back of the crowd. At 71, he had spent most of his life repairing dairy equipment for farms across 3 counties. He rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. Near the end of the sale, 2 workers rolled out an old cream can. It was tall, dented, and stained by decades of use. The lid had been sealed shut with a thick ring of solder. A faded layer of grime covered most of the metal, and one side showed marks where someone had heated and resealed it long ago. The auctioneer tapped it with his knuckles. "Who'll give me $10? Nobody moved. The crowd barely looked at it. "What about 5? Still nothing. Then Harold stepped forward and quietly raised a hand. "45, he said. The entire crowd turned. For a moment there was silence, then Buck Rawlins laughed. Buck owned the largest salvage yard in the county and never missed a chance to make himself the center of attention. $45, he shouted. "For an old cream can, Harold? That's the finest piece of empty metal I've ever seen." Laughter spread through the crowd. "Maybe he's buying milk from ghosts," someone called. More laughter followed. Harold never answered. He walked to the can and rested one hand against the cool metal. Buck kept talking. The crowd kept laughing. But Harold was no longer listening. His eyes had settled on the uneven solder line around the lid. The work was old, but it had been done carefully. More important was the weight. When he nudged the can with his boot, it shifted differently than an empty cream can should. Something about it felt wrong. Or perhaps Harold thought, something about it felt hidden. As the laughter faded and the sale moved on, he paid his $45 and loaded the can into his truck. Yet all the way across the lot, one question stayed with him. Why had someone gone to so much trouble to seal it shut still? Harold Mercer had spent more than 50 years working around dairy farms. He had repaired cream separators, milk pumps, cooling tanks, and nearly every piece of equipment a farmer could break. Across the county, people knew his truck. They knew the sound of it pulling into a yard when something important stopped working. More than once, Harold had kept a farm running through a hard season simply because he could see problems other men overlooked. That was his gift. He noticed details. A bent bracket, a missing bolt, a strange sound hidden beneath normal noise. The years had taught him that small things often carried the biggest truths. Since his wife Evelyn passed away 7 years earlier, Harold lived alone in a small house outside town. Most evenings were quiet. He spent them in the workshop behind the house, repairing old equipment or restoring tools nobody else wanted anymore. People respected Harold's skill. They trusted his hands. But they rarely paid much attention to his opinions. In a world that moved faster every year, patience looked old-fashioned. Harold never argued about it. He simply kept working. That evening, the cream can sat on his workbench beneath a bright lamp. He circled it slowly, studying every inch. The more he looked, the less he liked Buck Rawlins' explanation that it was nothing more than scrap metal. Factory seals followed patterns. This one didn't. The solder line wandered unevenly around the lid. Some sections were thicker than others. Tiny tool marks appeared beneath the old metal. Whoever sealed it had done the work by hand, and they had wanted it to stay closed. Not for months, not for years, for decades. Harold ran his fingers across the cooled solder and felt a quiet certainty settle into his chest. Someone had intentionally hidden something inside that cream can long ago. The real question was not what was inside. The real question was why someone had gone to so much trouble to make sure nobody ever looked. As he studied the can beneath the workshop light, Harold found himself remembering the Whitaker family and the old farm where the strange container had spent so many forgotten years. The Whitaker estate auction had drawn a larger crowd than most. Samuel Whitaker had been dead for nearly a year, and with no direct heirs left on the farm, everything had finally been sold. Tractors, tools, livestock equipment, and household goods that had accumulated over a lifetime were scattered across the property waiting for buyers. Most people in the county remembered Samuel Whitaker for one reason: the rumors. 35 years earlier, money had disappeared during a difficult season when several local farms were struggling to survive. No charges had ever been filed, and no proof had ever surfaced. Yet somehow Samuel's name became attached to the story. Over time, suspicion hardened into belief. By the time Harold reached old age, many people spoke about Samuel's guilt as though it had been established fact. Harold never believed it. He remembered Samuel differently. Quiet, hardworking, proud. The kind of man who helped neighbors repair fences after storms without expecting payment. Something about the old accusations had never felt right. Standing in his workshop, Harold turned his attention back to the cream can. Under the bright lamp, he scraped away another thin layer of grime. Beneath decades of dust and oxidation, he noticed something unusual. A section of solder near the lower seam looked different. Not new exactly, but newer than the rest. It suggested the can had been opened and resealed at some point after it was originally manufactured. That discovery made him pause. Then he tested the weight again. Slowly, he tilted the can from side to side. The balance wasn't natural. Whatever was inside seemed concentrated near one section of the base, as though something solid had been carefully placed there years ago. Harold stared at the can for a long moment. The more he examined it, the less it looked like an ordinary farm container. It looked like a hiding place. And if that was true, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure its contents remained hidden. That evening, as darkness settled across the countryside, Harold carried the cream can deeper into his workshop and began preparing the tools he would need to finally open it. Harold set the cream can beneath the brightest lamp in his workshop and studied it from every angle he could find. The metal carried decades of scratches, dents, and wear, but none of those marks interested him now. His attention stayed fixed on the thick ring of solder circling the lid. The more he examined it, the more certain he became that this was not factory work. Someone had sealed it by hand and had done so with unusual care. Using a small magnifying glass, Harold found faint tool marks near the edge. They were easy to miss unless a person knew exactly what to look for. Tiny impressions showed where a tool had been pressed against the metal again and again. Whoever closed the can had wanted it shut permanently. He sat quietly for a moment, remembering Samuel Whittaker. The town had never stopped talking about the missing money. During one of the hardest farming seasons anyone could remember, several families struggled to keep their land. When funds vanished from a local cooperative, suspicion spread quickly. Samuel denied taking anything, yet rumors followed him for the rest of his life. Harold remembered something else. He remembered neighbors bringing Samuel broken equipment because they trusted him. He remembered Samuel spending long evenings helping older farmers repair machinery without asking for payment. Those memories never matched the story of a selfish thief. That was why the cream can bothered him so much. He lit a small torch and began warming the solder a little at a time. Rushing would damage whatever might be inside. Heat loosened the old metal slowly, and Harold worked with the patience that had carried him through 5 decades of repairs. Every few minutes he stopped to inspect the seam. Nothing about this can felt ordinary. Hours passed. Outside the windows, the countryside grew dark and silent. The workshop clock ticked steadily above the door. Harold continued working inch by inch. Eventually, he noticed something unexpected. One section near the bottom produced a dull sound when tapped, while the rest rang lightly. The weight was concentrated there, exactly where no cream can should carry extra mass. His pulse quickened. Not from excitement, but from certainty. Someone had hidden something inside and had expected it to remain undiscovered for many years. The question was no longer whether the can contained a secret. The only question remaining was what. Just before midnight, the final section of solder released with a soft crack. Harold carefully set down his tools and lifted the lid a fraction of an inch. For several seconds, he simply stared into the darkness inside the cream can. Whatever had been hidden there had remained untouched for decades. He slowly widened the opening. Inside was not money, not jewelry, not the treasure most people would expect. Instead, he found several bundles wrapped tightly in oilcloth. His heartbeat quickened. One by one, he removed them and placed them on the workbench. The first bundle contained old letters. Their paper had yellowed with age, but they remained surprisingly well preserved. The second held ledger books filled with neat handwritten entries. The third contained bank receipts, deposit slips, and payment records dating back more than 30 years. Harold sat down and began reading. The deeper he went, the stranger the documents became. Several receipts showed large transfers of money made over many years. Ledger entries matched the amounts almost perfectly. Payment after payment had been recorded with remarkable care. Whoever kept these records wanted every dollar accounted for. Then Harold noticed something else. The name receiving the payments was not Samuel Whittaker. In fact, the records suggested Samuel had been sending money to cover losses created by someone else. Harold read the pages again, then a third time. The numbers told a completely different story from the one the town had believed for 35 years. According to local rumor, Samuel Whittaker had stolen money during a difficult farming season and escaped responsibility. But these records suggested the opposite. Instead of taking money, Samuel appeared to have spent years quietly repaying debts that were never his. Harold leaned back in his chair. The room felt unusually still. Everything he had found pointed toward one conclusion. The town had been wrong, very wrong. As he sorted through the final stack of papers, one item remained unopened. A sealed envelope rested at the bottom of the can. Across the front, written in faded ink, were 4 simple words. To whoever finds this. Harold stared at the handwriting for several moments. Then he carefully opened the envelope and prepared to learn the truth Samuel Whittaker had hidden for more than 3 decades. Harold unfolded the letter with careful hands. The paper was fragile, but the handwriting remained clear. He immediately recognized the signature at the bottom. Samuel Whittaker. For several minutes, the workshop was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall as Harold slowly read each line. The letter began with a simple statement. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the truth can finally be told. Harold continued reading. 35 years earlier, during the financial crisis that nearly destroyed several farms in the county, money had disappeared from the local cooperative. Suspicion spread quickly. Before long, rumors settled on Samuel. He denied the accusations, but few people believed him. The letter revealed what had really happened. Samuel's younger brother Thomas had taken the money. Young, desperate, and terrified of losing his family, Thomas made a terrible decision during a moment of panic. When Samuel discovered the truth, he faced an impossible choice. He could expose his brother and send him to prison, or he could protect him. Samuel chose family. According to the letter, Thomas confessed everything privately. Overcome with guilt, he wanted to turn himself in. But Samuel refused. He believed prison would destroy his brother's life and leave Thomas's wife and children with nothing. Instead, Samuel accepted the blame that the town quietly placed upon him. The documents in the cream can prove what happened next. For years, Samuel secretly repaid every missing dollar himself, month after month, year after year. Every receipt, every ledger entry, every bank record, they all told the same story. A man everyone believed was a thief had actually sacrificed his reputation to protect his family. Harold felt a heaviness settle in his chest. The town's greatest scandal had been built on a lie. The letter explained why the records had been hidden. Samuel knew the truth might never be believed while he was alive. Rumors were stronger than facts in small towns. So he sealed the evidence inside the cream can, hoping that one day someone would find it and understand. His final words were simple. Do not remember me for what they said. Remember me for what I chose. Harold lowered the letter and stared across the workshop. At that moment, he understood one thing with complete certainty. He could not keep this discovery to himself. The following morning, Harold gathered every document, receipt, ledger, and letter from the cream can and placed them carefully into a box. Before speaking to anyone else, he drove to the County Historical Society. If the records were genuine, they needed to be verified by people who could examine them properly. The process took several weeks. Historians reviewed the handwriting. Bank records were compared against archived documents. Old cooperative records were located and checked against Samuel's ledgers. Piece by piece, the evidence confirmed the same remarkable story. Samuel Whittaker had never stolen a dollar. Instead, he had spent years quietly repaying money that was never his responsibility. When the findings were finally published, the local newspaper dedicated its front page to the story. Residents across the county read the article in disbelief. Many had grown up hearing the rumors. Some had repeated them themselves. Now the truth stood in black and white. The greatest surprise came when Samuel's grandchildren learned what had been discovered. For most of their lives, they had lived beneath the shadow of accusations made long before they were born. Suddenly, they were reading proof that their grandfather had been a man of extraordinary sacrifice rather than dishonor. The community responded quickly. Church groups spoke about the story. Neighbors shared memories. People who had once avoided mentioning Samuel's name began speaking of him with respect. Even Buck Rollins heard the news. The same man who had laughed the loudest at the auction now found little to say. Like many others, he realized how easily people accept rumors and how rarely they question them. The laughter that followed Samuel for decades finally disappeared. In its place came something far more meaningful: understanding. After 35 years, a good man's name had been restored, and for the first time since opening the cream can, Harold felt that Samuel Whittaker could finally rest in peace. Months later, Harold found himself returning to the old Whittaker farm one last time. Several months later, Harold parked his truck along the edge of the old Whittaker property and stepped out into the evening air. The farm was quieter than he remembered. The machinery had been sold. The livestock were gone. Most of the buildings stood empty beneath a sky painted with the colors of sunset. For a long moment, he simply looked across the fields. The land itself had not changed. The same wind moved through the grass. The same trees stood along the fence lines. Yet something felt different. For decades, this farm had carried the weight of a story that was never true. People had spoken Samuel Whitaker's name with suspicion. Children had grown up hearing rumors. Neighbors had repeated accusations without ever knowing the facts. Now that burden was gone. A few weeks earlier, Harold had visited the local history museum. Inside a glass display case sat the old cream can that everyone at the auction had laughed at. Beside it were copies of Samuel's letters, ledgers, and receipts. Visitors stopped to read the story every day, not because of the can, because of the man behind it. Samuel's true legacy had survived. Harold smiled as he remembered the final lines of the letter. Some people spend their lives protecting others without expecting recognition. They accept criticism, misunderstanding, and even disgrace because they believe certain sacrifices are worth making. Samuel had been one of those people. The town finally knew the truth. His family finally knew the truth, and perhaps that was all he had ever wanted. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Harold turned toward his truck. Sometimes the most valuable things hidden away are not money or treasure. Sometimes they are the truth.